I'm curious to know your thoughts in terms of the correlation of these people that eat a lot of foods that have very healthy gut microbiomes. When you look at the blue zones, like Sardinia, of course, you got Okinawa in Japan. Do you see a correlation of these people eating foods that are extremely healthy for your gut that are able to live longer because of that? Is there a direct correlation between those 2 points?
Yeah, and that's the actually really talked about in the longevity paradox. One of the things that's fascinating is this relationship between the wall of your gut and the microbiome. And it turns out from animal studies that aging occurs at the most fundamental level as this wall of our gut begins to break down, and that bacteria and bacterial pieces begin to come across the wall. And the longer that wall is intact, then you will not see any signs of aging. And so
So
that
you're saying build
interaction,
the wall.
build the wall, exactly. So actually, all of my programs are actually designed to build the wall and to
Yeah.
make the mucus layer that protects the wall the most intact. So these societies, first of all, they have wildly different diets. And I lived in the only blue zone in North America for most of my career, Loma Linda,
Mm.
California. And so I'm actually the only nutritionist who has actually lived in a blue zone for most of their life. So
Really?
yeah, so
Huh.
but the diets are wildly different. And so when we say, well, all the blue zones eat beans and grains, well, no, they don't actually. Or all the blue zones eat a low-fat diet. Well, no, Sardinia and Crete use a liter of olive oil per week. That's a lot of olive oil. The Okinawans basically use no oil except a little bit of lard.
Mm.
The Okinawans eat 85% of their diet is a purple sweet potato. The Acciarolis, which is a town south of Naples in southern Italy, don't eat any grains, any breads. They eat mostly anchovies and red wine and a ton of rosemary. So, what I think unifies all of these different diets is all of these blue zones eat very little animal protein. And that's actually the only unifying feature
Mm.
in all of these diets. So, and I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, which is, believe me, a meat eating town. And for me to say we should really cut back on the amount of animal protein that we eat in our diet, it makes me cry every time I think about it.
It's
But
tough. It's
it is
tough.
tough.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think that is because this is the thing I constantly think about, right? Which is America has one of the most highest demand in terms of seeking nutritional health, the latest fitness exercises, the latest diets. It's the biggest market, right? Yet we also have a very poor ranking when it comes to life expectancy versus countries that are far less developed than us that have very little resources. So, do you feel that it comes really down to the fact that we just need to eat less animal products and just eat less in general?
Yeah, I mean we're overfed but undernourished. There was a report in the U.S. Senate that basically says our soils are so depleted of minerals and vitamins that we could eat constantly, but we would never get the fundamental nutrients that we need. And when
Huh.
I put this, yeah, when I put this slide up, I asked physicians to guess when the Senate report came out. Most of them say, oh, 1990, maybe 2000. It was actually 1936. And yeah, 1936.
Wow.
And you think about how depleted our soils were then And now our soils were once living organisms in and of themselves. The soil has a microbiome. The microbiome actually got nutrients into the roots of plants. And now there's no microbiome left in any soil. The soil is devoid of nutrients. You can grow a plant that looks like an apple or looks like an ear of corn, but that apple and that ear of corn has no relationship to what was grown 100 years ago.
Mm.
It's just devoid. So yeah, we're overfed but undernourished. And you're right. We have one of the worst health spans of really any country. Um, and our lifespan for the last 3 years in North America has actually decreased 3 years in a row.
Wow.
Yeah, 3 years running now, we've decreased our lifespan.
What are we at now? 75 on average for
Yeah,
men and
but yeah,
females?
well, women are actually up into the 80s, but men are about 74. But it's decreased 3 years in a row. And if the predictions are right, and sadly they're probably going to be right, I'm a baby boomer. My kids, the Gen Xers, will have shorter lives than the baby boomers. So the baby boomers will probably be the last, unless the millennials can get the point that we're really stupid. I mean, baby boomers actually have far worse health, are on more medications than our parents were, the greatest generation. And it's like, what? The
It just
baby
keeps getting
boomers,
worse and
yeah,
worse and
we're
worse,
going
you're
to be the
saying?
healthiest ever. We were so smart, and it just keeps getting worse.
Do you think there's some correlation with the fact that we are getting this to this point of overpopulation, and you've got these companies like Monsanto that are creating GMOs just because you're right. I mean, putting in genetics into vegetables and all these foods allows them to grow more foods at a cheaper cost. But there's certainly downsides to that, but it's kind of unavoidable because they control so much of the supply. So, is that a big part of the fact that even though Americans are trying to eat healthy, that from the ground up, it's just broken system that where we're eating a lot of these pesticides and chemicals.
Yeah, unfortunately, about 98% of all the corn grown in North America is genetically modified. Same with soybeans. And it doesn't, and the other sad thing is GMO no longer is the most worrisome thing, is that Roundup, which is glyphosate, is now sprayed on conventional corn, conventional soybeans, conventional canola, conventional oats for desiccating them before harvest, which makes it easier to harvest. And this stuff is not washed off. And I go into the dangers of Roundup, both in the plant paradox and now in the energy paradox. It's scary stuff. The other thing that's interesting is we are getting a push for regenerative agriculture. And
Mm.
back 50 years ago, before factory farming, farmers would rotate crops. They would maybe plant corn one year, then they'd plant soybeans, then they'd let the fields go fallow and they'd plant alfalfa to regenerate the soil. And it turns out there was a study commissioned by the Department of Agriculture in Pennsylvania looking at perfect high tech, now conventional agriculture versus the old system. And they looked at salaries, they looked at profits for farm workers, they looked at profits for farmers, and they looked at production. And they found that the old system actually produced more food and more profit compared to perfect factory farming. And it was actually suppressed for a couple of years, and then it was put out on PLOS, PLOS, and I recommend anybody look it up. It's startling. This has all been fed to us literally as a profit motive for big pharma and big agriculture.
Now, are there any actions to reverse that now that's happening?
Yeah, I mean that's really happening. I had a farmer on my podcast, the Dr. Gundry podcast, actually last week. Farmer Dan from Texas, Farmer Dan the Chicken Man, and he's an engineer, and he decided that he didn't like engineering anymore. He was bored, and so he decided to engineer chicken farming and beef farming, and he had some land, and so he's gone back to farming chickens. Again, I grew up in Nebraska, and chickens were a farm animal that were let out in the fields where cattle graze, and they're insectivores. They love insects, so they would make a beeline for the cow pies, the turds of cows, and which are loaded with insects, and they would claw through the cow pie, eating the insects, and they distribute the manure. And so that was normal. And then you ate the chicken eggs, but nobody really ate the chickens because they were too tough. And so he's redone this. So he now takes his chickens in a movable cage, and they go to a certain area where the cows, and they eat everything, eat the cowboys, distribute the manure. And that, so he has regenerative agriculture, and he lets his fields go fallow. And the chickens, of course, their poop fertilizes. So he doesn't have to fertilize anymore. And
Wow.
this is happening.